Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we are live broadcasting from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. with an on-site audience. We're so pleased that you've joined us today. Before we begin, I have a few tips for you. For those of you who have joined us on-site, hopefully you've picked up the handouts that we left outside of the room. And you can ask questions, but we ask that you hold on to your questions until the very end of the program. And when you do, please use these microphones in the aisles. For those of you watching on YouTube online, you can also participate and ask questions. Please use the chat feature. You will also find that there is a hyperlink to the captioning, so you can follow along that way as well. For today's presentation, Bill Creech will discuss immigration records in our holdings and how they are screened for privacy. He will focus on records from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, headquarters between 1906 and 1964, and INS World War II enemy alien detention camp records. Mr. Creech started his career at the National Archives in 1977 as a part-time student technician, and in 1981, he became a full-time employee. From 1982 to 2000, he was the subject area specialist for labor and economic record groups, including many of the 1930s programs from the New Deal. Since 2003, he has been the main subject area specialist for Immigration and Naturalization Service records, as well as records concerning public buildings in Washington, D.C. Mr. Creech received his formal education from George Mason University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts in History and European Studies and a Master's in History. And now for our presentation on immigration records and privacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bill Creech. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And I hope I won't have too much issues. I seem to be coming down with a cold, so my voice, I hope, will hold up. Yes, this talk is we're going to focus primarily on the Foia privacy issues that come up with the INS records that are in the custody of the National Archives. The Freedom of Information Act has 9 exemptions, and one of them is Exemption 6. And Exemption 6 concerns personal privacy issues. So any records that have information concerning a personal nature, medical records, personnel files, social security numbers, adoption records or adoption information, and one of the old loaded ones, the records pertaining to moral turpitude. This concerns anything that might deal with accusations of, say, prostitution or whatever that are unfounded. There's no proof at the end of a document that indeed this person was arrested and tried for prostitution or some immoral acts. Then that kind of stuff has to be pulled out. If there is something there that shows the person was indeed arrested and there's legal documents, then of course we can leave it in. Otherwise, it has to be taken out. The 2 main groups of records, series of records in 85 are that have this type of information in it, is the subject policy files, which are the headquarters records, main correspondence files for the INS from 1906 to 57. The central office files, which are from 57 forward, but what we have here that's open goes up to about 1964 with a lot of gaps. And enemy alien detention camp records. These are the enemy alien detention camps that were run by the INS during World War II. A lot of other federal agencies ran enemy alien detention camps. And they have similar restrictions. I only work with the INS stuff, and that's basically what I'll be talking about in this series of talks. The FOIA exemption for privacy is a 75-year restriction. After 75 years from the creation of the document, this information can be released to the public. There are three exceptions to this exemption before 75 years. The first one is if you were the person requesting your record, you have a right to see it. So if, for example, you were detained in an enemy alien camp in the U.S. during World War II, or you have an INS file here at the archives and the headquarters records, you have a right to see that record. The second is if you have written permission from the individual who the file is about, notarized, that that person's given you specifically, your name, the right to look at their file. And the third exception is if the individual is dead. This can be determined several different ways. The first would be if a person has a death certificate, which is what we prefer. But if in looking at the documents we determine that this person would be 150 years old today, then we usually decide on our own that it's safe to assume this person's dead and we're not going to worry about releasing any kind of private information on them. The process that we go through to do this is twofold. First, for the subject policy records, the records are arranged by case file number that the INS created and assigned to these files when they were active files. There is a subject index to this material, which is the only way to get into it because the actual boxes themselves on the shelf are just strictly by the file number, case file number. The subject index is available on microfilm here at the National Archives building, and it's also available online through Ancestry.com. And what a researcher would do is they would either look at this index either before they come in online or to come to National Archives and look at the microfilm and determine a file number that they would like to look at. This is primarily a subject index. If you're looking for a name of an individual, the odds are you're not going to find it on this. Sometimes there are names on this index, but as a whole, it's a subject index. If you get a file number, you send that file to us or you come in and you fill out a slip for us. Now what happens is I look at these files and I determine whether or not the files fall under the 75-year coverage. I physically take the file out and I have to go through the file page by page. This can sometimes take a week. It can sometimes take minutes, depending on the size of the file. The files can run anywhere from 4 or 5 pages to 400 or 500 pages. And so the first thing we have to do is determine whether or not there's anything there that needs to be screened out. These are not the kind of records you can skim. For example, a file may say policy file concerning marriage exemptions. And you think, okay, it's a policy file, there's not going to be any personal information in there. But in a policy file, sometimes you'll come across where somebody in some office sent an example in, the example of Mary Read, and there it is. There's a personal file there that, in theory, you wouldn't think would have been in that file based on what the subject category was, but which is in there. So what we have to do is we have to go through and we have to determine whether or not anything in this file falls under those exemptions of Social Security, moral turpitude, adoption, anything like this. If we determine that it does, then we remove the document. Everybody got handouts, the handouts that were up in the stage. We remove the document and we replace it with a card like this that goes in with a document or documents that could be 1 page or 20 pages we pulled out that describes what was pulled out in general terms. Obviously, we can't be specific that what we pulled out because the reason we're pulling it out is for privacy. So we can't say we pulled out, Mary Jones's file on prostitution because, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of pulling the file. So the file would say something, the card would say something like the file number, children's medical records, and a year, or a span of years in which the files cover. And we make a copy of it, we attach it to the documents that we pull out, and we file those separately. And what we do is we review every so many years the stuff that's been pulled to see if the 75 years has been finished, and therefore we can put the files back in where they belong. The central office file material, which is the post-1957 records, is a little bit more difficult to work with because we don't have an index per se. That's all we have is file titles. So lots of times from the title you can't really tell what is in the files. Fortunately, at this stage of the game, we don't have very many of those here. Many of those records still have not been declassified. The first process of these records is to go through a declassification process, which deals with national security before they come to the National Archives, the main building here to be open to the general public. So the stuff that we do have, the central office files that we do have that are open, there's not a lot of them. But if you want one of those files, they tend to be fairly large, and once again, it can take a while to screen through them to make sure there's nothing that needs to be screened out. The other series of records are the enemy alien detention camps. Now, these are different from the War Relocation Authority camps, which were where Japanese Americans were interned. These were camps that were run by primarily the INS, but the State Department also had camps, the Army had camps, Justice had camps on their own that weren't part of the INS camps. And what these were individuals that were in the country at the time that war broke out, World War II broke out, who they may have been here 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but they never became American citizens. They were still citizens of Germany or Italy or Japan. So these people they had to register, and then they were interviewed by the FBI. And if it was determined that for whatever reasons they might be a security risk, they were sent to these enemy alien internment camps. The INS ran about 9 of them. They were scattered all over the country. Many of these people remained in the camps for the duration of the war. Sometimes they were used to exchange American citizens that were in Japan or Germany or Italy, and then other times they just remained there at the end of the war and then were released. And sometimes they were deported at the end of the war. But while they were in these camps, they were taken care of as far as food, clothing, housing, and all that, and medical. So a lot of these records have a lot of medical information in them. So we have to go through any kind of case files of the individuals to make certain that any medical stuff is removed. Now, the way we do that is if you're looking for an individual who was in the camp, Joe Smith, we'll say, each camp is arranged, has an index, a name index to those people that were interned. There's not a universal index of everybody that was interned by the INS or indeed by everybody that was interned by any government agency during the war. So the first thing a person has to know is they have to know what camp a grandfather or a father was in or they were in. Then you look at the index to get the case file number. Once you get the case file number, then much like these others, we have to go through and look at the records. Now, if the person who's requesting the record was in the camp, and we get these, we get just like the Japanese American stuff, then we still have to go through and screen it, because even though he has a right or she has a right to their records, including the medical stuff, believe it or not, they don't have the rights to other family members' records. So if for some reason or another they happen to have been, Mr. Smith was interned by himself, but many times families requested to come and live in the camps with their husbands or fathers or whatever the case may be, their records are mixed in with his. And there may be children medical records stuff in there which we have to remove. Same with the case if a person, we know for a fact the person was dead. We don't just say, okay, he's dead, here's a death certificate, here's the file. We still have to go through those files and make sure there's not other family members that were part of that file that may still be alive, in which there's medical information that will be restricted from their use. These records are heavily used. And one of the problems that we have working with these records is that when you go online and you see these INS records described, it's sometimes unclear if there's restrictions, and if so, what the restrictions are. So one of the issues that we do have is I sometimes have people that show up, at the door and have files they want to see. They're here for 2 days. They give me 50 or 60 file numbers. I have 2,000 pages of stuff that needs to be screened. They're not going to see it in 2 days. As I often tell them, I can't read a Russian novel in an afternoon. I can't screen all this material in an afternoon. So, sometimes we have issues with that where a person will we'll just have to tell them, you'll have to come back at a later date. You'll have to, write us. It would be preferable to either write me beforehand or email me beforehand or call me beforehand and let me know, when you're coming and what file numbers that you want. And that way, that gives me a little bit of a heads up as far as being able to screen the records go. Outside of that, one of the other issues we have with the policy records is that the index that you use to get the records, get access to the records, was created by the INS. And my understanding is a lot of it was while the records were still current, because they used the index to pull files when they need them for the work that they were doing. They're not complete. The files are no longer complete. So somebody could send me 25 or 30 file numbers they want to see, and there's a chance they could walk in the door and I tell them, none of them are here. There are no files. Well, I saw it on the index. Well, unfortunately, the index is no longer accurate as far as what may still exist. Yes, there was a file in 1935 created for this subject, but it no longer exists, and we don't know why, and INS does not know why. So that is pretty much the talk. I'm primarily, like I said, focusing on the issues of privacy as far as they deal with INS records in the custody of the National Archives. A lot of INS records are still in the custody of the USCIS, which is what the INS is now, and they would follow similar procedures, but I can't really speak for exactly what they do as far as their process goes. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Bill. This is Andrea. While people are thinking about questions, because you gave us a lot of information very quickly, I wanted to say that because we're live broadcasting and this is a YouTube video, that it's captured, and so if you feel that you've missed something, you can go back and rewind and hear what Bill had to say. And also everything is being captured by a captioner. And about a week from today, I should have all of those words as a transcript. So if you want to review what he said on paper, send a message to me to the Know Your Records program. And the Know Your Records program email address is kyr@nara.gov, kyr@nara.gov. And if it's okay with you to
Yes.
send you an email, your email address, please.
It's my name, William.Creech, Creech, @nara.gov. And I am the main archivist that works with these records. So, there's obviously if I'm on holiday for a week or so, there's some people that will try their best to fill in, but I'm the main point person for these INS records. So.
I think what often happens is we think of questions afterwards, and so I'm going to give everybody an opportunity. If you do have a question, we ask that you please use the microphones that are located in the aisles because we're broadcasting live, and so that way we can capture your voice on screen as well. Let's see. I do see that we have some online folks. There are people watching. I invite those of you who are watching on YouTube to submit your questions in the chat feature while Dorothy makes her way to the microphone. And it looks like we have a question from our on-site audience. Thank you, Dorothy. Mm-hmm.
You want me to go first? Okay. Bill, forgive me if I'm not putting things together right, but you said you were releasing things after 75 years, and that sometimes there were families with small kids in these camps.
Right.
If perhaps you've got somebody who's like 87 years old and still alive, when the release date comes, are they making exceptions for people who are still living not to release their materials even at that date? Or are they going to just release no matter?
Well, they're released no matter, but the point is not how old the person is in the document, it's the date in which the document was created. Mm-hmm. So in most cases, there's not an awful lot of people that are, as far as children go, at 75, there's a possibility that, yes, some of those records will be released. The people will probably be, in their 80s.
Right.
When it's released, but that would be, as my understanding is that's what will happen. I mean, eventually all the War Relocation Authority records, all mm-hmm. those Japanese Americans that were interned, at some point all those case files will be open at 75 years. The 75-year mark would be from 1946 forward, because that's basically when the final camps were completely closed down. Not everybody went home, and there were some people for some of those camps that were transferred to INS camps for deportation, and believe it or not, there's actually people in the early 1950s who were still on Ellis Island that had been detained during World War II that had not been deported yet from those camps. But as far as the official closing of those camps, 1946, all those records should be open.
Right here. Oh, thanks. It's quite timely for me to be able to participate in this lecture because part of my trip to Washington was supposed to try and do some research on the case of a friend of mine who passed away about 20 years ago. She was an American-born citizen. She married in Italy in the 1930s, raised her family in Italy, and voted in Italian elections, which may have been the reason that she was called into the U.S. Embassy in Rome or to the consulate in sometime in the early 50s and had her citizenship summarily revoked. Her story was that actually her passport was dropped in the garbage can. Later in the 50s, either due to a change in legislation, unfortunately, I didn't take notes on her oral history when she was alive, and I regret that, she was able, by traveling to the United States, to recover her citizenship, which she successfully did. Now, last week I went out to College Park to the archive branch. Mm-hmm. The archive was very helpful to me. I thought perhaps I would be able to go into some of the diplomatic traffic, which might have instructed the consular staff to take these actions. But the archive's answer was that this type of record relating to citizenship and INS records are not part of the 2% that are archived. The only thing I'm thinking that might be an avenue, since she's passed away, and I'm in touch with her family in Switzerland, would be through the Freedom of Information Act to try and reach her records. How do you think a person might go about researching this?
Well, there's probably an A file on her that's is either still in the custody of the USCIS or because she's passed away, you don't do you know when she was born, roughly?
When she was born?
Yeah.
She passed away at about 88 in 2000, so she must have been born in about 1908, if I got my arithmetic right.
Yeah, there's a possibility that her A file has been transferred to National Archives facility in Kansas City. You can go online, their website, and I think they have a listing of all the A files that they now have that were transferred by USCIS. But A files are files that, starting around World War II, the INS started creating alien files, thus the A file. And from that point on, anybody that came into the country or had dealings, even in some cases they came in before that, but had dealings after 1940-41 with the INS, had a file created on them. And the A file basically contains everything about their process from the time they got off the boat until they actually become U.S. citizens. And up until fairly recently, all those records were still in the custody of the USCIS. They have now begun to transfer large groups of them to the National Archives, but they're all going to be sent to Kansas City. They're not going to send them to here or to other regional branches. Everything's going to be sent to the Kansas City branch, and that's who you need to contact. So there's a good chance that because she got her citizenship back in the 50s, there was an A file created on her, and it should be either with Kansas City or the USCIS. Now, if it's with USCIS, you'll have to file a Foia. You go online to their site, and there's a form 639 that you fill out and send to them. Don't send it to us. I get these all the time. But they're a Foia for records that are still in the custody of the USCIS. And there's another thing, I think on that form or on their website, it's a little bit misleading. I've had people say that after they read it, it seemed to imply that any immigration records prior to 1982 are with the National Archives. That's not true. So the A files are, are with them or at Kansas City, but they're not. There's definitely a lot of hundreds of thousands of files on individuals that are still with the USCIS before 1982. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I have limited experience with those records. I'm just wondering what type of information would be in the records, and I know over time it might change, but like photographs, naturalization papers, just what type of records?
Well, the policy papers, the policy material in 85, those are headquarters records, and usually there's not photographs. There can be a little bit of everything in those, but it's not the actual official file. Many times, if the kind of personal information you get from those files are from people who were, they appealed their deportation, and so there would be a appeal board hearing, and those files tend to have the most personal information in them, but usually not photographs. Now, the enemy alien detention camp stuff often have photographs of the person that was sometimes his family, always the individual, like our guy Smith, have a photograph of him. Say if his wife and his kids were there with him, I've sometimes seen the mother's photograph, not usually the kids, although I've occasionally seen that. That's not absolute, but usually there's a photograph of the person who was originally picked up and interviewed by the FBI and then ended up in the camp. And medical stuff. There's lots of medical records because the camps were, they had medical facilities, so there's dental records and there's shot records, and if somebody was injured or all that kind of stuff, there's basically the same kind of medical file you would find if you went to your doctor and got your medical file. So it can be quite a bit of personal information in the detention camp stuff. Not necessarily with the kind of stuff that would be in the enemy alien detention camp stuff is more, that kind of personal stuff would probably more likely appear in an A file or something. Not medical records, but, the more personal things like a photograph and things like that, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I have several that are online. I'd also like to put in a plug for the Know Your Records program. We did during the virtual genealogy fair last year, we had an entire session about A files. So if you go to the YouTube channel for Know Your Records, you'll find that A files there. If you are having trouble finding it, send me an email at kyr@nara.gov. And so going to our questions online, starting with the first one, the question is for Bill, is there a reference information paper about the microfilm of the index?
There's a little paragraph, if that, I guess that's what I mean by information paper. It used to be a handout in the microfilm reading room, because that's where our copy of the index is on microfilm, and it's kept in the National Archives microfilm reading room. Okay. I don't know whether all the regions have copies of it or not. I'm not sure about that, but and there was a little, I think, one paragraph description of the index and what it was pertained to. Okay. Another aspect of the index too, I guess I should mention. The index is primarily for the subject policy files from 06 to 57. It does include references to other stuff that was never part of these records. Sometimes you'll come across references to files before 1906, and sometimes you come across references of things like petitions of naturalization and declarations of intent and stuff like that, none of which is part of our collection here. Those are basically, well, the declarations and that type of material, those are court records. For some reason, this index has some of those mixed in with it, but it is primarily for the entry 9 for the planning and policy subject stuff, so.
Thank you, Bill. I'd also like to add, I don't know if there's a reference or finding aid online. It might be worth doing a search on our webpage to see if that's available online as well,
Yeah.
besides our microfilm reading room.
If the microfilm has been described online, it's T458 is the microfilm publication for the index. And I believe that's how they, I think that's one of the ways you can get into it from Ancestry. I have a copy here, so I don't go on Ancestry. I'm not 100% certain, but they do have the index on Ancestry. I think somebody told me you can access it through the T458 reference, which is the microfilm the National Archives has. So.
That's very helpful to know that number. And also, if you're at a National Archives facility, you can access Ancestry.com for free. And going into we have several questions, and they're going to seem like they're all over the board because they came while you were talking. Our next question is, what is the end date of the internment camp records that will be used to determine whether 75 years have passed? That is, when will individual file reviews no longer be needed?
Well, 75 years from the end of the documents. Now, most of the camps were closed by 46. There are exceptions, and Ellis Island is an exception. Many of these camps, as they closed, I'm not 100% certain of what the review process was, but there were people that they just did not let go, and they were being held for deportation. And as each camp closed and they were consolidated into other camps, eventually the final camp ended up being Ellis Island. And so there's some individuals that were detained in enemy alien camps in 1942 that were still technically being held as enemy aliens, or at least deportable aliens, as late as I think 54 or so. Matter of fact, there was a riot at Ellis Island at some point in there, but some of these people were just saying, do something with us, either let us go or send us back. But I mean, we're just kind of sitting here in limbo for 15 years. So it would probably depend on the individual as to exactly what the date would be. But most of the stuff should be open within 75 years from 1946. I'm a history major, not a math major, so I can't do that in my head real quick. But it'd be, within the next, 5 years or so? Something like that. So.
Thank you so much. Our next question online, the question is about redaction. Several people are interested in this answer. Is the redacted information from the requested file only medical information, or are there other rules that would result in a redaction?
No, definitely not just medical information. Social security numbers are redacted or removed. As I mentioned before, this really vague term called moral turpitude, if it's legally unfounded, and once again, it's what I would call character assassination without proof. So, I've actually seen records where INS people were interviewing neighbors about somebody, and then somebody would say, "Yeah, well, I see her with all kind of men. I'm pretty sure she's a prostitute, or she's taking money from them." Well, if there's nothing in that record that showed that she was ever arrested for prostitution, then we pull that. Now, if somewhere in that file it says, yes, on affirmative examination, we found that, that Mary Jones was indeed arrested in San Francisco 4 years ago for prostitution or whatever, court records are open records, and therefore we would leave that in because there'd be a court record on that saying that she was arrested for prostitution. Not just that she was prosecuted, but she was arrested for prostitution. So there'd be a court case on that, and therefore that would be allowed to be left in there. Strangely enough, the one thing that you would think might be also pulled out of that was any accusations of communism, especially in the 50s when everybody's being accused of being a communist. But that's not, if in that file we come across something where somebody says, yeah, he had a big old bushy mustache, looked just like Joe Stalin, and I swear he was with those labor unions and all that other kind of stuff, and I think he was a communist. No proof that he was, but we wouldn't pull that. They don't consider that to be, that unfounded accusation to be something that need to be pulled. But moral turpitude, homosexuality, prostitution, that kind of stuff, if there's no legal proof that indeed these individuals were found guilty of this or arrested for it, then we pull that kind of stuff out. And adoption records. Adoption records are another really big no-no. So you do find that in the post-World War II period, a lot of Americans bringing back orphan children from Europe. And there's every now and then you'll come across material pertaining to the names and all that kind of stuff. And so we have to redact that out of there.
Fascinating. I hadn't thought about adoption records. I don't see any on-site questions at this moment, so I'll continue with the online questions. Sure. What are the ARC or National Archives identifier numbers for the Internment camp series? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I don't off the top of my
That's
head.
fine.
I'm sorry. There's about 15 entries. They're arranged by the name of the camp. So as if somebody comes in and asks, for the first thing we would tell them, if they said, "I'm looking for, my father was interned during World War II as an enemy alien. Do you have anything?" Well, most of the time, most people don't know whether they were interned in an INS camp or a Department of State camp or an Army camp or whatever. So the first question is, do you know the name of the camp? Lots of times they do, and so we can determine what kind of camp it was by that. Once you get the name of the camp, then you just go to the index, and the index to each camp, there's not a master index, but the index to each camp is usually divided up by nationality. There's an index for Japanese, index for German, index for Italian. And that's how we get to it, to the actual case files of individuals. Now, there's more than just case files on these camps. That's what most people are interested in, the case file aspect, because most people are doing this for genealogy purposes. There are also the administrative records of each one of the camps. And so those have their own entries. So each camp may have 4 or 5 entry numbers. Of only one of the entry numbers would be to deal with the case files. But the entry is not as important as the fact that you're not going to be able to look up anything online as far as an individual goes. You're still going to have to contact me about the camp and the index that I have to look at, because it's not something you could pull up online. So,
Thank you. That was a thorough answer. This next one, I'm kind of stumped on. I'm not sure you'll be able to answer at this time. The question is, in general, why would a detainee end up in the camp of, say, the INS versus a camp of the Enemy Alien Control Unit of the Department of Justice?
I don't know. I don't know exactly what the criteria was. I know that in most cases, based on, I guess initially, the enemy alien registration cards that you were required to fill out if you were not a citizen when the war broke out, you would have been interviewed. I'm assuming also that the FBI probably had people under surveillance even before we entered the war, of definitely German and probably Italian, because the war was full blown in Europe by 39. So by 40, they were probably already keeping an eye on certain people. Whether it had to do with how the individuals were swept up, or whether it was just divvying up the workload, I'm not really sure. State Department, I think, had a lot to do with individuals who were enemy aliens that were actually brought over from other countries. Although there's an exception to that with the Japanese, like the Japanese from Peru or something that were sent up here. I think they ended up in Crystal City or one of the INS camps. The Army also had its own camps. I'm not really sure how they divided all that up. And there were many, many smaller detention centers. That's another thing. I get a lot of letters from people saying, that my grandfather was temporarily held in Minneapolis. And I don't know what happened after that. I think he was let go. Well, what about every city and all had its own kind of small camp, or usually a building. It wasn't a camp, it was a building that they rented, or the jail or whatever. And people would be brought in and they'd be interviewed by the FBI, and sometimes they were held there for weeks. Many times, though, these were temporary. After a certain period of time, they were either released out to the general public again, or they would have been transferred to one of these other main camps, either INS or Justice or State Department or something. But I often get people asking about those camps. There are no separate records specifically for the hundreds of small detention centers that were scattered across the country where a lot of these initial interviews were done. Sometimes in the INS records you'll come across something where there'll be a report sent in from Minneapolis on June 2nd, 1943, saying we're holding these 15 people. But that's it. I mean, there's no way of being able to through looking through the index and all to get a complete list of everybody at all these small camps and how long they were held, and who was there at any given time. So. And once again, I use the word, I shouldn't call them camps. My understanding is most of them were like municipal buildings or stuff, or vacant buildings in which the government took over temporarily and set up these little holding areas until they determined what to do with the individuals. So.
Thank you, Bill. That's fascinating. We had one more question come in because we were talking about redaction, and you mentioned that sometimes adoption records are in there. The question is, can the adoptees themselves ask for these files?
I honestly don't know. I don't think so, but do not quote me on that. I honestly don't know. They're not, it's probably, I don't necessarily mean these are the official adoption records either. They're not. What they are, they're correspondence with the INS or with the individuals bringing these children over, explaining who they are, basically. It's not the official adoption records of an individual, but it's kind of Joe and Mary Smith are coming back into the country and they're bringing a child that they adopted, Mary Jones, that they adopted in Italy, and sometimes a little stuff about who the birth parent or parents were and that kind of stuff. But it's not the official adoption papers that would have been required for an individual to adopt a child. But it isn't a record. It is a record, and it sometimes does give the name of either the birth mother or sometimes the mother and the father, and that's what they're real picky about. So.
Thank you so much. I think that ends our online questions. I did want to put in another plug for the Know Your Records program. We'll have on March 9th Freedom of Information Act requests at the National Archives with Special Access Foia staff managers Martha Murphy and Foia and Privacy Officer Joseph Scanlon. We'll discuss how we respond to Foia requests. And Bill, thank you for a really fabulous talk. I learned so much, and I hope everybody else did too. Actually, we have one more question that's come in, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Just a short question. When it comes to doing research on a woman who may have had one or more married names, what's the rule that you would start with the maiden name, or that files would? There's no rule.
I would say give me every name that you know.
Every name that you.
Yeah, I mean that's the easiest thing to do. And this, I know I'm getting a little bit off the INS part, but in a way it's kind of linked, and I maybe should have linked them to begin with. But with the War Relocation Authority records, with the Japanese American internment stuff, this is a big issue because many times, not only do you have the person was originally went into the camp as unmarried, but was married in the camp, and also many times they had anglicized names, and so sometimes the records are officially under their whole Japanese name, and sometimes they're under, and this is also with the enemy alien camp stuff when it comes to the Japanese. Sometimes they will put that, George. It'd be under George Tanaka, even though he had a Japanese first name, and then sometimes it's just under the Japanese first and last name and no George. So it's best to give every name that you're aware of that's a potential as to what they would have gone in. Usually with the Japanese Americans, if they went in with a maiden name but came out married, it's under the name they were originally interned under, and that's kind of the rule of thumb, but it's not an absolute. So, and I will say, in parting once again, if you decide to do research in these records, and you go online and you look at that index, obviously in the alien stuff is different, but the subject index for the INS the policy files, please email me those file numbers you get beforehand and let me know when you're coming in, because it'll save both of us a lot of time, because I can tell you beforehand that you're looking at, hundreds of pages. It might be a couple of weeks before I can get it screened, or I can say none of your files panned out, there's nothing, or I can say those records have already been screened, come in whenever you want to. And that's another thing too. Once screened, always screened. So what we do when we screen the records is I note on the folder the date that it was screened, and that it's screened. So we have a little in-house database in which I can quickly look and see whether or not the file's been screened already. What that doesn't tell us, if it's not on that list, it doesn't necessarily mean, it either means that it's not been screened or it doesn't exist. And that I can't tell until I physically go up and open up a box and look to see whether it's there. But it saves everybody time if you drop me an email or even a phone call, and tell me when you're coming and, what you're interested in, so.
And again, your email address is william.creech@nara.gov. We have online, people are very appreciative of your presentation. Someone says virtual applause, and then another person says ditto. This is a good presentation. I agree. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks.